I think the core message here is, we know, and there's been, fortunately, a great push by lots of organizations, including ASCO and the NCI, to say, listen, one of the reasons we don't get enough patients on clinical trials is because our inclusion and exclusion criteria are too stringent. Okay, so we say if you're a patient, the sort of common one that was always used was HIV. If you're HIV positive, you can't enroll in this clinical trial. That was sort of a cut and paste phenomenon. In the beginning of the HIV era, people said, well, it's not safe. And then, 25 years later, protocol still had it. So it didn't really make sense. Age as well, another important one that we did look at in our study. And so there were sort of a couple goals with this project that we did. The first was, this off quoted number of clinical trial accrual percentages in the 2, 3, or 4% that's sort of been out there forever. If you go back and dig into the details, there aren't that many studies that have actually shown that, validated that number. And there isn't a lot of recent information. So one of the things we just wanted to have the opportunity to do is say, if we look at a group of patients with advanced solid tumors and we pick that population who all started a new therapy, let's use that as the denominator. Patients with advanced cancer starting new therapies, patients who I think most oncologists would say should be considered for a clinical trial. And let's look at the percentage of patients who actually got a clinical study drug. So in a sense, just sort of validating, which we did, that clinical trial accrual percentage is low. Might have been more impactful if we'd found it was dramatically different, but it was sadly pretty close to what we expected. But then we asked the question, well, what are things that we can look at that we clearly have data on for this entire population of patients that are typically considered exclusion criteria for clinical trials? So things like, what are your blood counts? What's your kidney function? What's your liver function test? Those are all things that are really pretty easy to measure in the context of this population. And we wanted to see, based on what the thresholds are in clinical trials, what percentages of patients would not qualify for clinical trials based on those typical cutoffs, and it's a lot. Now, that's not necessarily making a judgment for a particular clinical trial about whether that exclusion criteria is valid or is necessary or not, but it does beg the question, if you see a certain percentage of patients by default who are made ineligible for clinical trials because of their renal function, then I think it's a really good push to all of us who are designing clinical trials to say, well, let's think long and hard about what we're making that renal function threshold, because if we're not really worried about the impact of this new drug on kidney function, maybe we should make that more lenient, or maybe we should not include that at all. And the same for blood counts, and the same for the liver function tests, what your hemoglobin looks like, what your white blood cell count looks like as well.